Austen, good afternoon. How are you, man?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. I mean, it's a little bit of crazy times and even crazier when I have a daughter who's graduating from high school, so that's been kind of crazy, but I'm excited for the next chapter for her, so it's all good.
Yeah, it's awesome. You're in the thick of it in multiple ways, I suppose.
I'm a little ahead of you on that front, so it's all. But hey, I thought it'd be fun just to you and I were chatting a couple weeks ago and kind of comparing, I guess, notes on the journey and war stories of starting companies. And, one, I think it's always fun for people to get to hear the story from you of the mission and what you're trying to accomplish and why you started BloomTech. But I think also I want to get into like founder stories and some of the things you've learned along the way, because there's an endless demand for that, particularly in the market we're in. So maybe it'd be helpful just start by giving folks a little bit of sense of your background and where you came from and why you've been on this mission to change education.
Yeah, we'll do the medium version. So grew up in small town Utah. After in a Mormon family, served an LDS mission in eastern Ukraine, and then came back. Was going to college, super bored, studying computer sciencey stuff, and decided I wanted to just do it my own way and get into tech. So I had a little two-door Honda Civic. I drove out to Palo Alto. I lived in my Honda Civic while I
Did you
taught
know
myself
anybody when you
enough.
came out, by the way, when you came out here?
No, no, not a soul. I mean, I didn't even have like a good mental model. I imagined that you would like arrive in Silicon Valley and there would be like stuff happening
Like a
all over
yellow
the
brick
place.
road that you just walk down and
Yeah.
they hand you money.
And then you get there and it's like, oh, it's just a bunch of people working in like nondescript office buildings. And I
Yeah.
like still don't know how to meet anybody or why I'm here. It ended up being really fruitful, and it worked out. But yeah, I don't know what I was expecting in retrospect. Like, I, like a, if you think about going to Wall Street, you'd think that there's like a building with a floor of traders and everybody's trading. Like Silicon Valley doesn't really have an equivalent. Everyone's just like
Nah.
doing their own thing. But it's still good. And yeah, long story short.
What year was that, by the way? What year did you come out here?
Oh man, 2013,
2013.
2014.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't, nowadays I instantly think like, what was the market like then? It was fine. Like it wasn't what it was
Yeah, we were
today,
sort of
but
post great financial crisis, iPhone kicking in, cloud software kicking in, obviously
yeah,
things
it's
like
pretty good time
YC
to be in the
kicking
valley,
in.
actually.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, YC was everybody was talking about it all the time.
yeah.
I actually went to one of the first things I went to was a startup school where, you know, uh, one of the first things I ever saw was Paul Graham interview Ryan Peterson for what was later learned to be his YC interview, and he got into YC. And now I know Ryan and Paul
And now
really
and
well.
now
So
famously
that
runs
was
Flexport, which is an amazing company. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I taught myself to code, started working at a company in San Francisco. And we go back home and everybody would be like, oh my gosh, like you made it, you're in tech, you're working in San Francisco. Like, and obviously I was, like a junior employee, in the middle of, a random company, but everybody would ask me like, man, how can I do what you did? And I realized there was just not, a really good path for somebody from central Utah to get into tech. So originally we started out by saying, hey, let's just build a really good code school and put it online. And then pretty quickly learned that online was really cool, but the real market demand was for something where students didn't have to put all of their financial savings at risk or enter into massive loans that they would not know if they would need to repay.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's was then started what we called Lambda School back then, and now is the Bloom Institute of Technology, or BloomTech. It's basically how can we make an online $0 upfront education work for people to get into tech, and we've been lucky to change a lot of lives along the way.
And obviously the optics of this are well known. We have like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 million open jobs in tech, or at least we have for some time running. It might change this year, but unfilled, by the way, millions and millions of unfilled jobs in tech. And so it just seems like such an obvious thing to tackle. But when you started it, there were a lot of coding boot camps and things like that. But as you mentioned, people to do that kind of had to put a pause on their life and find the money to go do it. Not to mention the folks that are trying to take CS and undergrad and racking up huge student loans, which is a huge topic in our country. So why do you, when you first got, when you first got started, you did YC, right?
Yeah. So we got into YC pretty early. It was, I think we were like 2 months old at the time from when we started. So we started one initial cohort that was fully paid up front. And between my co-founder and I, the idea was, hey, if we can, charge $10,000 a piece and enroll 100 people a year, we'll not hire anybody. We'll each take home $500,000 and life will be good. And we're actually on that path. Like we were doing literally that when I realized, just talking to a few prospective students, they're like, man, I'd love to do this. I just don't have $10,000. I was like, oh, of course not. Right. Like, that's why you're here. Maybe we can get you a loan. Like, yeah, I wouldn't really that's scary. I don't know you guys. I don't trust you guys. What if it doesn't work out? Like, yeah, that is the right mindset to be in as somebody who is looking at a school. So just one night I was like, what if, let's just make a deal. You pay me $1,000 up front and I'll, cover the rest of your tuition. And then if you get hired, you pay me after that. And it was like, oh, that's a no brainer. Like, I'm in. It's like, oh, that's interesting. So I emailed our list, I had this email list that we'd been building up over time. And every time I emailed that list, we would get an application or two. And then I emailed the list and I was like, hey, let's try something crazy. If you want to pay $1,000 up front, we'll cover the rest. And there were like 150 people of the 8,000 that emailed and said, oh my gosh, that's in, or that's amazing, I'm in. I was like, oh, there's clearly something to, de-risking it for people.
Lower the barrier.
So then I sent another email without checking with my co-founder, which was a story we can tell another time. And I said, well, let's try something even more crazy. Let's say it's $0 up front and we'll make the course longer. We'll teach computer science and, you pay us on the back end if you're hired. And that time we had like 2,000 people be like, okay, I'm in. I'm like, oh, shoot. A, we can't teach anywhere close to 2,000 people. B, like there's something really interesting here and much bigger than we had originally anticipated. So yeah, we got into YC basically with and by the skin of our teeth with, hey, yeah, we're profitable, we're doing all this stuff, but isn't this interesting that there seems to be this completely different market and this, in order to serve that market, you'd have to completely change your business model, your revenue would be completely different. It's just a completely different thing than anyone had seen before. And it took off really quickly. Yeah.
So let me, I want to throw a couple things at you and you can decide what order to take them in. But, I fast forward to where we are today. I mean, you kind of, at least from my vantage point, you sort of created this category. I know you didn't create it. I know it already existed, but you really brought to the forefront this notion of an ISA and this idea that people didn't have to go into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to get a great education and get a great job. So one, just love for you to talk a little about that and what's happened over the years with that concept and that topic. Two, I have to ask the question of like, what have you learned about higher education and why doesn't our higher education system want to explore ideas like this? Because we have such a huge problem with student debt, and yet we just keep seeming to do the same thing over and over. And then the third one I'd love to just explore is where are we today in education? Because it feels like you guys have made, like you said, I follow you on Twitter and you tweet out examples of all these people that have had life-changing experiences going through BloomTech, and then they get a job at Amazon or Flexport or BigCommerce or wherever. So I want to touch on where we are today, but talk about the first two. Why isn't our higher education system exploring more alternatives to the traditional model? And two, what have you learned about that whole ISA? Because I know you've dealt with the government and you've dealt with all kinds of people to try and sort this out.
Yeah, I mean, we knew when we were first getting started that it was going to be like, it was a regulatory, like nobody knew what to do with ISAs because the way we envisioned them was a very short-term equity instrument. So basically you'd owe us a percentage of your income for a couple of years. And we designed it that way because we wanted our incentives to be aligned with the student, right? If you make more, we make more. If you don't hit a certain threshold, we make nothing. And that was pretty elegant design. The difficult part of that is then you have to adjust payments monthly based on what incomes are, and then you have to be able to reconcile in real time what people's incomes are, and that gets tricky. And it wasn't necessary at the time, but we said, maybe there's some grad that's going to go make $200,000 a year. And if they get that job right out of our school, they may end up paying us $40,000, $50,000 a year if you just use, a percentage basis. So let's put a cap on it. Let's, limit the downside risk for the students as well. So it's kind of like, I know there's a stopgap where if you hit this threshold, you're done. And a couple of really interesting things happened. Regulators viewed, and actually a lot of students viewed, that cap as the cost of tuition, even though it wasn't. Even if a student repays all of that, we're still paying interest on the back end.
Right, of course.
And, so that's people are like, oh my gosh, this is a $30,000 school. You're like, not at all, right? And then regulators, there's actually, I don't know if I've told this story publicly before. So I was trying to get any regulatory framework established for ISAs. It was basically saying, regulate us however you want. We just want regulatory certainty so that we can, start to borrow against these instruments, so that we can do all this stuff. And this was 2016, or no, it was 2017, 2018, kind of 2019. And I got invited to the White House. And the White House was like, hey, the Secretary of Education would, love to have their team talk to you and understand what all of these ISAs are about, like what's happening. And I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill because the battle, but we wanted to be regulated, which was a weird place to be. And this was, after the Uber fallout, everybody was expecting a tech company to come in and say, don't regulate us, leave us alone, or to just ignore everybody. And we were like, please just give us regulatory guidelines that we know that we can work within, so that there's less uncertainty. And so I go to the White House, I talk to some of the chiefs of staff there, and they were like, this is the coolest, model ever. Like, you're de-risking it for the students, there's incentive alignment. And then I was like on the plane home, and Betsy DeVos, who was the Secretary of Education at the time, went on this rant about how incredible ISAs are and how student loans should be, eliminated and they should be replaced with ISAs. And she was a Trump appointee. And so instantly overnight, the political
became political,
shifted under our feet. And so before we knew it, there were, it was a very, very political battle. I did not predict that. I mean, I knew there would be politics involved, but it was a pretty bipartisan effort. And if anything, we had far more support from the left before that day than we did from the right. But yeah, that just blew everything up. And what we've discovered since then is a couple of things, to answer your second question. The incentives in higher education are very broken. If you talk to the average, dean of university, and you said, hey, what are your, job placement rates of your grads? The average dean would say, our purpose in life is not to provide, job seeking career support. We are an academic institution, which is, that's fine. That's totally valuable. That's, their prerogative. The problem is on the other side, government, and the pitch to the student is basically, you have to come here if you want to, have a career.
Right.
And so, if you ask the average student why they're in college, they'll say, because I want to get a better job. If you ask the average college why they exist, helping students get a better job is generally 4 or 5 things down the list. So it can kind of work accidentally in some cases. But then, from the government side, the government has said, that's, look at the data, people who have college degrees end up with higher paying jobs. So let's get everybody into college. Let's, guarantee loans. And so the universities realize we can charge whatever we want and students will pay it. And they have no context. They don't understand what's really happening. And you can say, come to this incredible university, look at how amazing our campus is, and it's all going to work out on the other side. So just,
it's just crazy to me that we have this system where we're perfectly fine with somebody taking on $100,000 of debt with no idea how it's going to get repaid and no guarantee from the institution providing the education that they will be able to repay it. And yet you bring out a concept which makes it much lower cost, much better access for the student. Now it changes the dynamic where I would imagine the institutions would all have to figure out how to finance these programs just like you have. And everybody's violently opposed to it. It's just mind-boggling to me. I really don't understand the opposition to it when the current model is so broken. I mean, what is it? $1.7 trillion of student debt. I mean, guys, it's not like we're at 100 billion and we're like, oh, maybe it'll work. It is clearly not working. And so it's always shocked me that more people aren't getting on and saying, Austen, how can we help you be successful?
Yeah, it took me a while to wrap my head around it. And then slowly I realized that if we become successful in doing what we're doing, it invalidates so many different movements, right? The first opposition we had actually was from the college should be free crowd, which like however you want to fund education, whether it's taxpayer or the individual paying, like whatever. But they realize, and perhaps accurately, that if we directly tie the ROI of education and the repayment to the future career, that two things would happen. One, there'd just be far less support for, hey, we need college to be free because, yeah, you got a better job, you can pay for it. That's totally reasonable. And then along the way, we are a vocational school, we don't do research. Right. We don't do anything academic. We don't do liberal arts. And I have no problem with those things. And all the time people are like, well, what's going to happen if you don't teach liberal arts? It's like, I don't know. People will choose whether or not they want to study liberal arts, and that's totally fine. Right. But anyway, so there was intense opposition, and then there are shadowy figures moving in the background all the time, trying to protect each other in ways that if you would have told me before I started, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought like, okay, that's conspiracy theory land. But no,
I would also argue, and you won't say this, but I would also argue there's a bias in the media towards the liberal arts, the notion that higher education is somehow creating a higher good by not focusing on vocations and jobs. And so they tend to attack anything that attacks that. We don't want anybody to attack that you should just go to college for 4 years and major in art history and go on and enjoy the rest of your life. And I think that's a bias that we have as well. And I like you. I mean, I went to a liberal arts college. It was amazing. But, most of the people I went to college with were very focused on getting a job and very proud of the jobs they got after college. And that was always something we were very focused on. So I hope it changes. I mean, you've obviously taken a lot of arrows in your back to try and drive new ground here. We are seeing, obviously, Garrett and Handshake. I mean, we are seeing colleges really embrace Handshake and the notion that part of their focus needs to be on helping kids get great jobs after college. So I think in many ways, those arrows that you've taken have helped other folks move things along. I know it's been painful along the way, though.
Yeah, I mean, I won't comment on, media stuff, but there's definitely, I'll comment very briefly. Like if any other educational institution was looked at with a fraction of the scrutiny that we were looked at, you would be able to write all those articles times 100 about any single one of them. But we're not perfect, and I try not to be bothered by that. So the other side that I think is happening is slowly but surely, we're starting to see people opt out of the system. We're starting to see people say, well, wait, what is my ROI going to be? I mean, if you would have asked that question when I graduated high school in 2008, people would have been like, ROI? Like, we've shown you all the graphs. Look at how much more college grads make. Like there's the ROI. But now we know it's not that simple. It's not anywhere close to that simple. And that's even if you're only looking at grads. And one thing that, a lot of people don't mention is if you look at the student loan debt, I think it's 28% of it is held by people who didn't graduate in the first place. So it's not just
Well, and 42% of
graduate
kids who
problem.
enter, I think it's 42% of kids that enter college don't graduate in 4 years.
Yeah.
42%.
And I mean, we often get compared to a community college, and people are saying, "Oh, you shouldn't go to a code boot camp. You should go to a community college." And community colleges have really nasty, I mean, for understandable reasons, but
Abysmal rates.
graduation rates
Yeah.
in the low 10% for a lot of
Right,
them,
right.
which, I think it's not entirely the fault of the community college. They're trying to do a valiant, difficult thing, but people have hectic lives and other challenges, and they're trying to make it all work, and it's hard.
So let me go into a positive mode. If you're successful, where is BloomTech in 5 years and 10 years? Like, what's the big vision, the big mission here? If we're successful, you're successful. I'm happy to be along for the ride as a small shareholder, but if you're successful, what's the big vision for BloomTech, and what happens in the industry?
Yeah, I think, and it's starting to happen at very, very small scale and small levels. The first is that, educational institutions become beholden to the outcomes that they produce. And, I think it's probably unlikely, but I would love for there to just be an unlimited blank check that universities cash and don't have to care about what happens after that. But more importantly to us, and more on the ground, is, we can look at a grad's income before they enrolled in us, and their first job. We lose visibility after a couple of years, but we have already helped our grads. I think they're earning something like $45 million a year, more than they were before they enrolled in BloomTech. And if we hit our targets, we pretty quickly get to the point. So if and that's just their first job, right? Obviously, they'll go on and
because you have folks salaries that are, based on the tweets, you have folks that are coming in as a barista making 20 grand a year and exiting with a CS job paying 120 grand a year.
Yeah, all the time.
Amazing.
So we think about student increase in income, and their ROI is off the charts, right? Like, the maximum they can pay us is $30,000, and our average grad is making more than that in an increase in a single year. So it's it's night and day. And so I was looking that we have created something like $1.2 billion of increase in lifetime income, assuming our grads never get another job or another raise, which so obviously it's pretty conservative. But we're trying to get to the place where we're doing that every year. So create $100 million a year increase in income for our grads. If we hit our goals over the next few months, that's where we get to.
That would be amazing.
So, and then obviously we're at a point where we're just going to start to scale, not just more students in the US, but internationally, more courses, more topics. We've kind of finally nailed the core model. And so it took us, as you said, a lot of arrows in our back to figure out how to make the core model really, really work. But soon it'll be time to scale here. So that'll be really fun.
Let's talk about that for a minute. And by the way, I'm maybe dreaming, but I hope at some point we can get away from attacking billionaires and other successful people and talk about how do we help more people rise up, right? To me, let's not tear down the top. Let's lift up the bottom of our society. How many people are making, $30, $40, $50,000 a year that could be making a lot more, whether it's computer science or some other vocation? Let's focus on that. Like, that's how you create a prosperous society. You generate more tax revenue. Everybody does better. Anyways. Totally. Let's talk about startup lessons learned. So you and I chatted every once in a while, but you were telling me a while ago, I think your comment was, I could build this business in half the time with 20% of the capital, knowing what I know now, or something like that, which I think is the feeling a lot of us have after our, I started my first company. I was way better in my second company, but just talk about some of the lessons learned along the way, things that you would share with other founders, or do share with other founders, since I know you're a mentor and advisor to a lot of folks.
Oh man. I mean,
we don't have another 2 hours, by the way.
Yeah. Some number of those things are things that you couldn't have learned without, having spent the money. Like, how do you how do you run an admissions process that with no money down can determine who's going to be successful in computer science? Like I know exactly how to do that now. There wasn't a rule book that you could look at 5 years ago to figure that out. But there's other stuff like I think, and one that I've been talking about with some other founders recently. I think you get into a trap, and for me, it was particularly poignant because about a couple years into BloomTech, it was now the biggest company I'd ever worked for, right? And I'm supposed to be the CEO of this thing that's brand new, and it's high stakes, and it's very, very intense. And a lot of CEOs end up in that position. But I think I started looking to kind of, okay, how do you run a really big company, right? How do you, clearly you need more meetings, clearly you need more layers of management, clearly you need, and I tweeted about this somewhat recently, but like you get to this point where teams grow, so you need more buy-in, so you need more meetings, so you need more managers, so people who are really good at talking become more influential. The people who are building stuff get kind of buried down in the totem pole. And probably the piece of advice I give the most, or the thing I look for in companies when I'm talking to other companies, is like, have you been able to avoid that spiral of from doing stuff to talking about stuff and planning stuff? And not that all talking about or planning is bad, but I would have done things very differently, and I think we would have had a much stronger tech foundation, which would have probably saved us years and who knows how many tens of millions of dollars if we would have had a stronger product, because we're letting the builders build earlier. And I think that's one of my main mental models now is how do you get everything out of the way? Like there's the core work that has to be done, and then there's all the supporting stuff that kind of has to be done in order to organize or to keep everything. So how do you minimize all of that stuff and spend as much of your time as possible doing the core work that has to be done?
Yeah, this is my, I call this my Gremlin theory, right? You remember the Gremlins movie where they sprout up in water and they're just popping up everywhere. And when you're building a company, all of a sudden you walk in and there's gremlins everywhere and you're like, holy crap, what do all these people do? And one of the ways you combat it, and I'm having this conversation with a lot of founders right now, is what matters? Like in the next 90 days, what is life and death for us and for our customers and our employees? And is everybody in the company focused on those things? Because what tends to happen in a market like the one we just came out of is, somebody's working. And I think, to be fair, this is a little bit popularized by Google back in the day of like, hey, spend a third of your time on something that is, completely irrelevant to the core mission. Well, Google also has the greatest business model in the history of the world.
If you have an ATM spitting out money in the basement, sure, 20%
and
time
so
for
it's
everybody.
it's such a great learning from you, because you go from 0 to 50 to 500 people, and all of a sudden a lot of people are working on stuff that honestly doesn't matter, and it's hard to keep that mentality of focus on what matters.
Yeah. And then you hire leadership, and they bring their habits with them, and they bring their people with them, and then all of a sudden you're running 4 companies within one company, and everybody wants to do things differently. And I mean, it's a difficult challenge. Even if I could start over, I would certainly be far better at it. That still doesn't make it easy. It's a difficult thing to do, especially at speed. But certainly, learned many, many lessons along the way that would make it far easier this time around.
What about advice for folks on fundraising? You've been through some good markets, some bad markets. Obviously, you were part of YC. You've got great investors around the table. Any advice you've had for folks? Because we're in a pretty choppy market right now, and just any advice that you'd have for people.
It's funny. So we raised, our seed and our A and our B within like a year of YC pretty quickly. And we were growing just at an outrageous rate. And then we got to a point where we realized that we could keep growing student count, but everything was going to fall apart if we did so. So we actually pulled back on one fundraise that was pending. And I still debate whether that was the right move or not, but we decided not to raise at that particular time and just get the business to where we wanted it to get to. And that was kind of like my growing up period as a founder, where you go from, riding one hype cycle into the next hype cycle to where you're actually building an honest to goodness business. And then our last round that we raised was in April of 2020. So I talked to folks who, have been through this crazy hype cycle. We sat the entire thing out. I haven't fundraised in, 4 years, other than in April 2020, which was, as scary as right now seems in tech, that was far scarier to me.
Yeah,
that was
that was right when COVID hit.
Will capitalism continue to exist?
Yeah. Fear was high.
Oh, fear was extreme, and it subsided partially subsided a couple of months after we had fundraised. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, and I think you can play games of, you want to, you can talk about, you want to raise money when you can, and you want to batten down the hatches and kind of like shift based on what the market is doing at any given time. I think that's a tricky game to play. My mind, the goal is to raise what you need to based on the future vision, and then figure out how to build a real business as quickly as you can. And there's a far different mindset when you're trying to build an actual business. You hire differently, you run meetings differently, you manage differently. And for us, it hasn't been, Ben Horowitz talks about the peacetime to wartime CEO. There is a little bit of, you get more intense and more real about stuff, and you can't just, but it's also, I don't know, there's building a business for the next fundraise CEO, and then there's building an honest to goodness business CEO. And we transitioned in 2020 because we thought that we had to. So, we're lucky in some ways.
A lot of folks are making that transition now.
Unlucky because we sat out the 2020, we might have been able to raise an outrageous round. But yeah, now everybody has their ear to the ground. Everybody understands the core metrics that we're really driving. Everybody knows we have the right team. Everybody's doing exactly what we need to get there. And I think we'll be far bigger and a far better company as a result of it. It's just so difficult when you've never seen that. I speak like I'm a grizzled veteran. I haven't been in this game. I didn't see 2000. But so I guess my advice to founders would be, the hype cycles are going to come and go. There's going to be times when investors are trying to take you out on their yacht to hang out with celebrities. And there's going to be times when, they don't want to take your call. So at the end of the day, get the money that you need to and focus on building a really good business.
I love that. That is the mode we're going to be in this year. I actually think for
100%.
founders that understand that and adopt that mindset, it's going to be a great year. It's going to be easier to hire people. Nobody's going to think you're ridiculous because you're not on a yacht with celebrities. It's going to be a much more sane time to build a real company, and I'm thankful for that. It's going to be tough, particularly for people who have to raise capital. But getting into that mode that you just said, raise the right amount of capital and go build a real company. I tweeted out the other day, Salesforce was a $3 billion company in 2009. Today it's 180 billion. So it's kind of 16x in 12 years. It never grew more than 35%. They never had some mega blowout year where everybody was like, oh my God, this is the greatest company in the history of the planet. They just kept reliably
they grew that thing like
building and growing and building. And guess what? It's a $180 billion company. So there are going to be a lot of those stories that come out of this window. It like you said, it requires focus, it requires patience, and it requires, focusing on what matters. So
yeah, I actually far prefer it to the other side of the hype cycle, where it's just like everybody is asking for the world and you're like, no, and why don't we just do this? Because it's not responsible. And that's a hard argument to make, versus because we can't afford to, and we need to hit these metrics or we go out of business in the long run. That's
pretty sobering.
Sobering is the right word. I prefer to be sober.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, it's been fun watching you build over the years, and I personally appreciate everything you're doing. I love the mission, and I hope the rest of the world gets on board with it, including our politicians and media folks, because I think what you guys are doing, and I'm confident BloomTech is going to be successful, but I think the rest of the world will look at this and say, we had to make a change in the way we were doing education. We just had to. And I think I've just got so much admiration for you and others that are trying to pioneer the trail here. So thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good seeing you.
All right, Austen. Thanks, man.